Today is Monday, August 28th. It's 11 o'clock in the morning. I'm Michael Aron from NJN News. Today for the Byrne Archives Project, we're going to talk to Harold Hodes, who served in the second Brendan Byrne administration, first as Deputy Chief of Staff, and for the duration of the remainder of the second term as Chief of Staff. Harold, how did you get together with Brendan Byrne?
Actually, it was a phone call made by the governor, to Mayor Gibson, who I was working for. As I think about it, it was would we come down to Washington and meet with Brendan Byrne? And Ken Gibson and I got on the train. We went down to meet with Brendan Byrne. Brendan Byrne asked Ken Gibson for his support, and Ken Gibson said yes. And that was the meeting of Brendan Byrne and Ken Gibson.
When and why in Washington?
I think Byrne was there for the, I could have been the National Governance Conference, I really don't remember, but he had some events in Washington.
When?
It had to be early 77.
Early
77, yeah.
So he was looking for Gibson's support in the primary?
Right, in the primary, yes.
And was it something that he could expect, or was it a
Gibson thought he did the right thing with the income tax, and said you have my support, and that was the end of the meeting. It was like a 10-minute meeting.
You think he invited him to Washington to impress him with Washington as opposed to...
Oh, no, I think he was there, but I think it was also just to talk to the mayor and to get his support, which I think he probably viewed as very key in the black community at that time. Remember Gibson, 77, when it had 7 years, just won re-election. Was a proven force not only in the city of Newark with organization skills politically, but also in the county and also in the state.
And why were you there with Gibson?
At the time, I handled a lot of the politics for Gibson, U.S. Conference of Mayors and things of that nature, City Council. So he took me along, and that's my first meeting with the governor.
What was your position in the Gibson administration?
I was assistant to the mayor with more on the political side, dealing with city council, governmental, federal governmental agencies and things of that nature.
And how long had you been with Gibson?
7 years.
7 years?
Yeah, right.
Did you help get him elected?
No, actually I was on the, what you would say was the opposite side of getting him elected. My first job was with Huey Adonisio, the former mayor of Newark, and I handled the Human Rights Commission. But Gibson and I always had a relationship because we always met somehow in City Hall at the coffee counter. And at that time, after Gibson won the first time, I came back to the state and ran the Model Cities program. And then had an opportunity to join with Gibson and stayed with Gibson after that. I did it for maybe 6 months to a year, and then I went back to Newark.
Let's go back on your credentials
a
bit. You're from Newark.
I lived in Newark, graduated high school in Newark.
What high school?
Weequahic High.
Same high school that Philip Roth
went
to.
Right.
But he's older than you.
Whatever. He's more famous than I am, too.
In some circles.
Yes.
And where'd you go to college?
I went to many colleges, but I ended up at the end of the cycle of at Monmouth College, which is now Monmouth University. Graduated Monmouth University in '65. Went to work as a school teacher in Newark, 4th grade, 36 kids. Stayed for about a year and a half. When the anti-poverty program came into the city of Newark, the community development block grants and things of that nature, I went to work in the anti-poverty program. Later on, I went to work in City Hall with Adonisio. Then from City Hall, I went down to the Department of Community Affairs. And then from the Department of Community Affairs, I went to work for Gibson and stayed for Gibson for about 6.5, 7 years.
What kind of family did you come from?
I came from a close-knit family. We lived on Chancellor Avenue in Newark. No one ever would have imagined that I would be into politics. My mother wanted to make sure that I got a job in the post office so I could have my pension and my Social Security. My brother is 8 years younger. My sister is 4 years younger, but we all graduated and went to Weequahic. And played basketball and the normal things in the Chancellor Avenue playground, which is now an ultimate field, I believe, and spent some of the summers there and summers down the shore.
What did your father do?
My father was a tavern owner in Newark on Jelliff Avenue. Had a very successful business with my uncle.
What was the name of the tavern?
Fitzthrone on West Runyon Street.
Fitzthrone?
Yes, tavern, right. And then we moved.
You're Jewish. That
yes, yes.
Sounds Irish.
Hey, what could I tell you? I guess at the time it was an Irish tavern turned Jewish, and then they didn't want to change the name. And then we moved from there up to the Weequahic section, and that's where I went to school and graduated from Weequahic.
Okay, so you're with Gibson. By what year do you think you joined Gibson?
I joined Gibson probably 71, if I'm not mistaken.
Okay, so you've been with him now as an assistant to the mayor for 6 years, and it's the
Right.
Byrne re-election time.
Right.
Did you and Gibson talk ahead of time about whether he should go for Byrne or somebody else?
No, because I remember that Gibson was committed to Byrne because of what Byrne did. That he felt that standing up for the income tax was a courageous thing to do. I believe the city of Newark at that time benefited from that. He used the same principle years ago in another primary, Gibson, when he supported Dick Leone against Bill Bradley. He remembered that Leone was the architect of the income tax, and Leone asked him for his support. He gave it.
Why was this big city mayor such a supporter of the income tax?
Because it was more beneficial to the city of Newark. And that's the way Gibson valued things.
How did you view Byrne at the time?
I didn't really know Byrne. It was a very interesting experience. I never really understood the workings of state government. I did city council work. I did national leaders at that time I was dealing with because of the rise of Gibson within the U.S. Conference of Mayors, and that type of legacy he was establishing there. And traveling the country with Gibson when we used to travel with Mayor Aliotta, who was the mayor of San Francisco, Pete Flaherty, who was the mayor of Pittsburgh, John Lindsay, who was the mayor of New York, and later on it was Abe Beam. They used to form the task force on Conference of Mayors, the urban scene, where is it going, and everything of that nature. So that gave me an experience of dealing with that, and then Gibson became, during that period of time, very close with Chairman Bob Strauss.
Chairman of the Democratic National
Committee, right. And he and Strauss developed a very trustworthy fondness relationship, which came into play for Gibson later on.
Gibson would later have troubles with the law, later.
Right.
After he left. Well, actually, he was indicted once when he was mayor.
Right.
He had a different image back then.
Yes.
What was it?
Well, his image was he was the first black mayor in Northeast city.
The very first?
Yes, I believe so. He was. His saying was, "Wherever American cities are going, Newark will get there first." That was a national saying. He was a very low key. He was an engineer by trade. He operated like an engineer. Everything was built. Kept cards in his desk about daily appointments. Very methodical. Unshaken. Very steady. And had amazing rapport with the community. I think his father came up, worked in the meat factories from Alabama. Very humble beginnings. And he just grew in the job, grew in everything. brought in the best talent that he could find at that time. Sharp James was on the city council. I believe Calvin West was on the city council, an aide to the governor. As I said before, very methodical.
Was he a leader?
Yes. No, there was no question about that.
Did he have a vision?
He had a vision for the city. At the time, we just had the riots. He brought stability and integrity to the city. He played a very crucial role in the bringing together people. It was hard at first, but over the years he was able to do it. He was very trustworthy. His word was you could take his word to the bank, whatever, and he had to establish that over the years.
This was 3, 4, 5, 6 years after the Newark riots.
Yes.
What was the condition of the city?
City was down. People were fleeing to the suburbs. Key areas of businesses were down. He was able to bring stability. He was able to bring respectability back to it.
In what way?
He was reassuring that here is the first black leader. He knows how to work the system. He's a man who, as I said before, keeps his word, reaches out to everybody, which shown the second time around when he ran against Senator and former Councilman Anthony Imperiale, who had his own strong base in the North Ward, but was able to win unanimously by galvanizing the people to vote for him.
How much had the city changed from 1967 to 72, 73?
It really didn't change that much, but you saw it was, in other words, the black community was a stronghold in the Central Ward, was now moving up to the South Ward. North Ward still was the Italian stronghold. East Ward was always the melting pot of the city. West Ward was a mixture of blacks and whites. Valesburg section, it was called, in the city of Newark. But you started to see a change of a migration of the black community into the South Ward in the 70s. You saw people fleeing to where the riots did occur, businessmen and that. But you also found businessmen that wanted to stay in the city. So therefore, the calming effect that Gibson has a way of bringing, he brought to the city. He drove in a checkered car, was his official city car.
Like a checkered cab?
A checkered cab.
Why?
Because that was what he didn't need, a fancy car. He needed a checkered cab, and those are the things that he brought. So he brought stability, brought calmness, and he went out and tried to cultivate the business community. Remember, years ago in the business community in Newark, they were the controllers or had a large influence on what was happening in the state. You had First Union, Bob Ferguson. You had Mutual Benefit Life, Bob Van Fossen. You had Beck at Prudential.
Another Bob. There were
another Bob, six Bobs. But those were important business.
Bob Smith at PSD&G.
Right. Those were important business leaders of the state that also affected the leadership of the state. Gibson was able to break through them and gain their confidence and trust. And I think that was a very important bringing back the stability to the city. They didn't run from the city. In fact, they reinvested in the city under Gibson.
What was he like to work for?
He was phenomenal. I mean, he let you work. He let you do your job. There was no hesitancy on his part. You built up your rapport. You built up your trust. There was another individual by the name of Dennis Sullivan, who was a Princeton University student, who came and did his thesis for a year and lived with Gibson's parents. and wrote a whole thesis on the election in the 70s. Later on went to Oxford. Later on came back to the city as finance director. So you had that dynamic, just to give you an idea of, this was an interesting staff that he assembled, not only there but also in the departments. He brought in people from the outside. So I mean, he was his own person. A lot of people thought that they had won it for him, but he was very methodical.
Was he a star?
Yeah, he was a star. He was a major star. He made the front cover of Ebony. He's a very big star nationwide in the U.S. Conference of Mayors. He started to make his rise in that, where he eventually led to become the president of the conference. Beat out rivals in the black community. Mayor Hatcher from Indiana. Gibson beat him for the U.S. Conference of Mayors Executive Committee and just kept on moving up. He was considered for the HUD secretary with Jimmy Carter till the last minute. So he had a local, statewide, national reputation.
And you were not his chief of staff?
No, there was no chief of staff in the old days. It wasn't needed. The different people had different responsibilities. Dennis was the finance guru. I was, along with the assistant business administrator, Elton Hill, the political person. So people had functional jobs that all worked together, but at the same time had different areas of expertise.
Did you have any prior contact with Brendan Byrne before that meeting
No.
in Washington, D.C.?
No, none whatsoever.
Why not? He's the governor of the
Well,
state.
I was just a little guy. You know what I mean?
How old were you at the time?
Oh, if you're testing my memory, I would say about 30.
Did Gibson interact with the governor?
I would say yes to a degree, but not that much as it became later on.
Why?
I just think he had other things to do, and it was a timetable and things of that nature.
As an observer, what did you think about Byrne's performance in his first term?
As an observer, it was probably clumsy. They made a lot of mistakes, but at the same time, he had the courage to forge ahead with the Cahill Meadowlands. He had the courage to bring in an income tax. Even though he said he never was going to do that, he did it. And as it turned out, today he maintained integrity in state government. He was the man that couldn't be bought. He brought that reputation in. He's been there. He was there before. He wasn't the best speaker in the world, but at the same time, he had the dynamics that were working for him. And also at that time, you had a different legislature. You had outstanding stars. People really cared and developed areas of expertise. The Al Bernsteins, the Alan Karcher, the Charlie Yates, the Ray Batemans. The camaraderie was there more so with Republicans and Democrats, and you had your party bosses that were largely influenced on the state. And normally, you would meet with the party bosses before you met with the Senate or the Assembly to seek out their approval. Because remember, you had Harry Lerner, you had David Willents. I mean, those were people into themselves at that day. And the first term, if I'm correct, Byrne was not really the choice as the second term of those power brokers until near the end, when they all got together and decided that a Brendan Byrne is what's really needed. And then you had
You're talking about the first election?
First term.
First election.
Right. Second election, that wasn't the he wasn't the choice.
You used the word clumsy. What did you?
Well, he was. He gave that impression. I mean, but he did things on his own. He wore the seersucker suits. He wore the white bucks.
How did that come across?
Well, I don't know. It came across the second term as, that's Brendan Byrne. I'm sure the first term it came with, looks of, what is this? But he knew that.
What did he project? Princeton? Is that
yeah, Princeton. Yeah. But that was him.
Another big city mayor, Paul Jordan of Jersey City, considered challenging Byrne in the primary,
right,
despite the income tax.
Right.
Why did Gibson think differently than Jordan about the income?
Because Jordan wanted to be a candidate for governor, and Ken Gibson didn't. That's as simple as that. And as it later turned out, Jordan lost his candidate for mayor in Jersey City. I remember the night that we were at the Legislative Correspondence Dinner, I believe it was, in Newark at the Robert Treat Hotel. Jordan, the week before, lost his power base in Jersey City, was getting out or got out of the race. And that's the night that Byrne said that, that he made the funny joke about the car and Susan, who just recently passed away, about the car. Susan has the car, so that's why I have to take the helicopter and things of that nature. And started to
Susan was his oldest
daughter. And this started, I believe, part of the momentum of Byrne with the one-liners and Byrne with the cracks, and people were starting to see a different Brendan Byrne. He became more of a fighter, and that's so
this
I mean.
This is the Legislative Correspondence Club dinner of the re-election year of '77.
Right.
This is when the wry humor started to show itself?
It might have been there before. I wasn't privy to it, but during the primary campaign, I stayed and oversaw the election in Essex County. In the general election, I traveled with Byrne. So that gave me a uniqueness to be with Byrne, even when we were 28 points down in the first poll. Coming out of the re-election campaign in the primary, and then moving on in early September with traveling with Byrne. I know I'm jumping around a little bit,
you were
but
28 points down after the primary, down
yes,
debate.
Right. Yes.
When Gibson endorsed Byrne, which you think was early in '77,
right,
like maybe January or February.
Well, we did because we were in the primary.
Okay, but when he did,
right,
did you think Byrne was going to win?
I had no idea. The only assignment I got was I had to go tell Harry Lerner, the Democratic chairman from Essex County, that we're not supporting his candidate, Ralph DeRose, and we're staying with Brendan Byrne.
Was that a difficult thing to do?
Oh, yes.
Tell us about it.
Well, first of all, there was.
Where did you go?
I went to Harry Lerner's office, which I believed was in the building, Commerce Building, in Newark, and I just went up and asked for an appointment, got an appointment.
Was it a county party office? Or
yes, it was a county. No, it was a county party office, and he was the powerful county chairman of Essex County, who was supporting Ralph DeRose, who's a state senator at that present time for governor, against Brendan Byrne and whoever. And Gibson said, "I think you ought to go up and tell the chairman who were sponsoring, who were handling." And I did. And he was a gentleman. He didn't like it, but he was always a gentleman. And we went back through the efforts of the Gibson organization, which at that time was highly political. He had people like Elton Hill, who was the assistant business administrator of Newark, who, along with me, was the top political guy at Gibson.
What does that mean, highly political?
In other words, they had the constituency that they can turn out an army. Whether they put the hats on or whatever, they went out and they had an army. They had an army in the South Ward, they had an army in the Central Ward, and the rest of the parts of the pockets of the other state. They had people who really loved Gibson and would work day and night for Ken Gibson.
Why didn't Gibson himself talk to Lerner? Why did he dispatch you?
Well, because he thinks I had a better relationship, so which wasn't true, but you know. Maybe because I was Jewish, you know.
Lerner was Jewish.
Jewish.
Did Lerner argue the case why Gibson should
No,
be
because
withdrawals?
he already knew it was a fait accompli. And I stated that Gibson gave his word to Byrne that he will support Byrne throughout the Democratic primary.
Why is the Essex County Democratic chairman not supporting an incumbent Democratic governor from his own county?
Because he probably didn't figure that Byrne, because of the income tax, couldn't stand up to the scrutiny on the income tax. And number two, was very unpopular. Everyone was calling him one-term Byrne, and everyone was giving him one finger when they saw him. So therefore, not only did Harry Lerner not think that, Bob Rowe, Congressman Bob Rowe, thought that. I believe Joe Hoffman, who was part of Byrne's cabinet, thought that.
These are people who all ran for the nomination.
Right, and I believe Ann Klein thought that. So there was a segment within the Democratic Party that it was OTB, one-term Byrne, which he proved wrong. But these individuals got into the primary, which probably proved better for Byrne, because I think that Byrne won that primary, I want to say 29%, but I'm not really sure, and that's when Paul Jordan got out too.
Why was Lerner so powerful?
I think that the system in New Jersey was that the chairmen were the powers. They picked the candidates, they picked the senators, they picked the assembly people. You had one man, one vote, so you would have maybe 4 senators from the county. They controlled all the patronage, not only in the state, but within their own counties. They ran those counties with an iron fist, whether you're Hudson, Bergen, Essex, or Middlesex. They were very strong. They determined who would be the candidates.
Is this the way it always was in New Jersey?
I guess it was early on. It was the only way until one man, one vote came into existence, and then second term in Byrne, open primary, caused more delusion of their power. But at the same time, that's the way it was.
Was it true on the Republican side?
Absolutely.
Or only on the Democrat
No,
side?
both sides. Both sides. You have powerful chairmen. As I said before you probably. Not that I was there, but before you probably talked about voting for the income tax, you probably went to the county chairman first to solicit their support, because they would tell or ask the legislators how to vote. Ask them what to vote for, what not to vote for.
So it was true in some counties more than in others?
Oh, sure. But it was strong also. Remember, you had Hap Farley in Atlanta County, so you stretched the whole part of the state. Where he was a Republican Party state senator that ran the South at that day. So Governor Hughes then had to deal with Hap Farley. But it was a different type of political atmosphere existing there. You couldn't, you dealt with the days, you dealt on friendship, you dealt on basis. It wasn't partisan, it wasn't personal. Later on, those issues elections became more personable. You lost the continuity, you lost the friendship. That's one of the unfortunates of that.
There are some county bosses still who function similar to the pattern you...
I think similar to the pattern, but probably a less degree of power, because you may have more, and you do have more independent candidates now. Legislators that make up their own mind usually, but there may be some pockets in the state of New Jersey where you'll see a breakthrough with that.
Was Ralph DeRose a substantial person?
Oh yes, he was a very well-known state senator, Italian heritage. Smart, and was, I think, the first Italian running, I could be wrong on that, for the statewide office.
What was the role of Martin Greenberg in Essex County in 1977?
Martin Greenberg, prior to 77, was a key element of the Byrne team in the first time out. And I would refer to him as probably the consigliere. He was also running as a state senator. So he had the combination of being very, very close to Byrne. At the same time, he's a state senator, moved in those type of circles, and was able to move from there later on, second term, to the Superior Court bench, and was very close to Byrne. Byrne had his people from the prosecutor's office, from when he was the prosecutor of Essex County, was a highly visible position. Charlie Corella, those individuals. He had his team in the early days of people that he knew, that he trusted. Not only coming from a campaign, but worked for or with during those early years.
Who did Labor support in that 77 primary, you know?
You know, that's interesting. I would have to say Charlie Marciani did not support Brendan Byrne in that election. In fact, I think he opposed Brendan Byrne. AFL-CIO, there was a toxic dam issue that I'm not really versed in. That was a splitting point between the unions and Byrne. Whether to, I think, rebuild it, Tox Island Dam or something like that. That was it. But
where were the education lobbies?
Byrne.
Why?
Because they liked that, but also I think during the '77 election, Matawan had a school strike, and I believe Byrne intervened or pardoned the striking teachers. I'm not sure of that, but that comes to mind. But he was always pro-education anyway, I would assume, back in those days.
What about some of the other bosses? David Wilentz, where was he in the '77?
He was in, but not of. You know, I mean, he was all over, but he was with Byrne.
Was there a Middlesex candidate in that race?
That's a good question. I should have. I don't remember, to be honest with you.
So he was hedging his bets.
Well, but he was really Byrne.
Yeah.
Yeah, crusty old man, but a nice gentleman.
Byrne would later make his son Chief Justice of the State Supreme Court.
Right. By himself.
What do you mean by himself?
Well, that was an interesting dynamic, if you want to relate, that normally a chief of staff or people in the counsel's office would know something that was going on. Brendan Byrne and Wilentz, to their credit, had their own private meetings.
David Wilentz or Robert?
Robert Wilentz. So it wasn't until the day before, the night before, that certain people knew who was going to be the next Supreme Court, me included. Wow. That's the way Byrne did it.
Wow. How about the Hudson County boss? Who was the Hudson County boss back then?
Well, what happened in Hudson County, as I remember it, was that Paul Jordan and there was the lawyer Bernie Hartnett were the team. Jordan ran, as you said, for governor. He had there was a mayoralty election in May prior to the June primary. Jordan's team lost in Jersey City. Wally Shields and Tommy Smith won. They supported Byrne.
They did?
Yes. So
before the election?
Before the primary. After the election, after they took power, or you take power in Hudson that night, they became, and therefore they were the power to say.
So that was good for Brendan Byrne.
Yes, it was. Right. And they stuck with Brendan Byrne in the June primary. Shields was the state senator later on, and they formulated that. Tommy Smith is the dog, and Wally Shields, and that was the beginning of
did Bergen or Camden have a boss in those days?
Well, Camden had Eric Ketty, who was the mayor of, and I think was considered the influencing factor down there. I don't remember where he was in the primary. Florio. Right, we had Florio too running the primary.
Florio was in that primary?
Yes,
in 77?
right, yes, right.
And he would go on to win the nomination 4 years later.
Right.
Okay. And how about Bergen? Do you recall if Bergen had a significant chairman?
All I remember is we had an unbelievable force in Bergen. Jerry Breslin, who was on the Sports Authority. We had Calabrese. That was Byrne's strengthhold.
Oh, yeah?
Okay, one of the strengthholds. Also because of what he did on the income tax, because it was the right thing to do. People like Bernstein and people like that came out of the legislature from there voted for, as I remember, voted for the income tax. So Bergen was, I think the chairman was somewhere else, and I think people like Jerry Breslin and everybody ran that operation.
When did you first meet the key Byrne 77 people like Leon, Ken McPherson, Alan Sagner?
I met them when Leon was the master. He was the campaign manager, so to speak. And you had to, in those days, I came down from Newark to campaign every day. And eventually, after for the November election, one story about Dick Leon, which he will say didn't happen, but did happen, is you went to a staff meeting with Dick Leon every morning, and his assignment to you was to make sure that you knew what was going on in the state before you came to the meeting. So you would have to read the newspapers. Well, we didn't have, telecommunications then. And if you didn't know the newspapers, he would ask you to leave the room. Also,
where was the meeting?
The meetings that were in right outside of Trenton. It was an old DeVega sporting goods store on that stretch of land, not on, I'm trying to think, where the lottery is presently today. Across the way in the mall was the Byrne headquarters. But first of all, you had to open up the Byrne headquarters, and the person that did that was Bob Torricelli, right? And he had to borrow some money, I believe, from his mother to put down on the deposit down on the store. So, he was the first person that left state government and went over to run the campaign. Remember, Brendan Byrne is not a popular fellow. I mean, Alan Sagner, to his credit, was a finance chairman, would call a meeting and maybe be 6 people, maybe 6 of us. But he had this loyal following of what you said before, McPherson, Corella, Breslin, I mean. And then he had a wonderful guy that was the real campaign of the manager, was Henry Luther, who was former secretary and then left that and went to work and left government and did other things. Henry Luther was an individual that could make you smile. No matter what you did, no matter how mad you were, you would walk out of Henry's office with a smile and said, you know, I don't know what he really said. And he had that mannerism about him. And he'd just go day and night. But he had that warm sense of humor, and you just liked Henry.
I met Henry years later
right.
when he was on the Waterfront Commission.
Right, which where Ralph DeRose went later on.
Yeah?
Yes, Bi-State Waterfront
Henry
Commission.
was the guy who made you feel good about yourself.
Yes, exactly, and he could do that, and that was I believe that was, people didn't realize it, but that was a very key ingredient, and that's what Henry brought to that campaign. Never said a bad word about anybody, complete calmness. And Leon ran the campaign.
All right, so the campaign was in an old sporting goods store.
DeVega.
That went bankrupt? It was
Yes,
empty?
it was empty.
It was empty.
Right.
It was like near the Olden Circle or that area of
Yes.
Trenton?
Yeah,
Brunswick
Brunswick Circle.
Right.
Right.
And you had to read the newspapers, and you had to drive an hour from
Right,
Newark
right.
to get there.
Yeah, I didn't have a chauffeur. I didn't have a trooper.
So what time did you get up in the morning?
I got up around 6:30, 7 o'clock in the morning. And you had to be punctual, Leon. Couldn't be late.
What time was the meeting?
I think it was 9 o'clock. Yeah.
So you could spend an hour with the papers and an hour getting there.
Yeah, right. Yeah. But the difference of this it was a group that was committed and loyal to Byrne. There were no big consultants. There were no big pollsters. It wasn't. You didn't operate that in that vacuum, in that environment, I should say. This was hard politics. Leon was the only one that was able to deal with the outside consultant, David Garth. Jeff Laurenti was part of the communication team, but he could bring the film or whatever it was to David Garth in New York. Leon was the person who ran that side of it.
Who first suggested that you get involved?
Well, that was part. What happened was that I developed somewhat of a relationship with Byrne in the primary in Essex. And I don't know if it was Jerry English or Dick Leone that suggested that I come down and do what I was doing there to the campaign.
When did you start working in the campaign?
Right away. Right after the primary, yes. Maybe that summer off, but came down in September or August, I don't really remember. And I was doing the schedule, and I was traveling with, then I started to travel with Byrne.
You were doing the schedule?
The political schedule with the front office, coordinating the governor's schedule, both politically, state functions.
Who was your counterpart in the governor's office?
Actually, it was Edie Byrne, who was,
Edie Byrne?
Yes, was a cousin of the governor's that was presently in the governor's office, scheduling office. And the key person that I used there was the Diane Jantz. And she was the logistics person. She was the very key person who had done this previously for the governor and also was an invaluable person to me.
Was it difficult to schedule a sitting governor's campaign activity?
No, because in those days a lot of people didn't really want to see Byrne, so and at the same time we were able to function. And I think as the campaign and the momentum built up, that was a key ingredient with Byrne, getting him into the right places and everything else.
You said that you developed a relationship with
Right.
him. How?
Because I was the only one in the helicopter at times, or in the car. So I traveled with Byrne. So I
Why did he select you?
It was my looks. I gather, to some degree, he had to have trust in me. And over the year...
You were new to the
Yeah,
operation.
but I also proved my loyalty to him.
How?
By overseeing the primary in Essex, winning the primary in Essex. Byrne won that primary off the line. Dan Gaby was involved in running that. Phil Freeman, who's a Superior Court judge today, was picking up all the literature. Charlie Waters, Elton Hill. I mean, it was just a whole array of people that were, as I said before, believed in Brendan Byrne. And we were out doing these things. We were delivering literature.
All right, so at some point you think August or September, you go to work for the campaign.
Right.
How much time passes before Brendan Byrne says, you're the guy I want to go around?
Well, actually it was because I knew the schedule, so I would be doing that anyway. And then it just came together. That's more of a question. I don't know if he'll remember, but that was more of a question of it just happened, and I developed that uniqueness. And Degnan was still in the council's office, so he stayed behind. Leon was up there, so that was your circle. And Degnan was the only one that made sure Byrne was a candidate, so we go on from there.
What do you mean Degnan was?
Degnan was one of the few people that encouraged Byrne to run.
Right.
So you had the loyalty already built up by people who are making those sacrifices, whether it be the primary, and now turning to a general election where you're 28 points down, and the fortitude to stay with Byrne and get the job done. And there were certain breaks in the campaign that they got, but at the same time it was Byrne.
We'll get to that. What contact, if any, did you have with Harry Lerner after the primary?
Very, not that. I was doing the campaign. I wouldn't have any role. I mean, I was very respectful to him.
Did he work for Byrne? Did he go to work for the
at the end, yes. At the end of the day, he did. But at the same time, no one thought early on that Byrne could win. But as the momentum gathered, you could see it.
When did that happen?
Well, there were
how did it happen?
Well, there were a couple instances that caused that. First of all, I believe Leon cut one of the best commercials you could have. I think it was the commercial where Brendan Byrne said he made a mistake, where he said, "I told you that I wasn't going to do an income tax. I had to do an income tax because it was the right thing to do."
Did he talk to camera?
Talk to camera. I believe that was one of the few commercials of the campaign. And it was done by David Garth and Leon. And
it was a mea culpa type.
Yeah, it was. I think it was. It was Phil Freeman. Another person that worked there was Hank Morris and Phil Freeman, who are on their own today, their own consultants, and still in the political business. As I said before, I think you had Byrne out there. There was an instance where Bateman came up where he voted, I believe, in a committee hearing for the income tax. Jeff Laurenti found that. There was another instance where Bateman was always talking about the alternatives to the income tax but never produced it. Byrne asked him to produce a plan. He had Simon, former United States Treasurer, work on that plan. That plan was produced and delivered to the press corps at 4:30 on a Friday afternoon, left on everybody's seat at the Robert Treat Hotel, which later became to be known as the BS plan, Bateman-Simon plan. Therefore, that didn't work for Bateman.
Why would they do it at 4:30 on a Friday afternoon?
Well, that was the old days where everybody wasn't around normally.
They didn't want publicity for that?
They didn't want publicity for it. There was no one really there to explain it, number two. And that's when...
Why did they leave it in the Robert Treat Hotel?
Because that was the press conference was scheduled for. And they left it, and that gave Byrne the comeback of the year in all debates and everything else henceforward.
Which was what? What was the comeback? BS?
BS. It was BS plan. And the momentum, editorial board and things of that nature started to build.
Did you approve of that BS plan line?
Yeah, I liked it. Someone who passed away didn't like it just recently was Dottie Seltzer, who was another loyalist of Byrne, Brendan Byrne.
Tell us about her. She was what?
She was his secretary. She was the gatekeeper. She was an individual who wasn't afraid to say what she thought. She was a person that you would go for guidance and would be able to read his moods. She was invaluable. If you had to do a power rating today of women, and Dottie Seltzer was here, she would be in the top 3 because she controlled Byrne years because she controlled that gate, and she had his trust, and she was just a unique individual.
And she didn't approve of BS?
She told him, I read that in the obituary where she told him she didn't approve of it, and he said, okay, and he went out and did it anyway.
She thought it was undignified.
Right, but that's Brendan Byrne. Right.
When Byrne was 28 points down, did you think he had a chance?
Probably not. But when you're in these type of campaigns for the first time, you're eager, you're optimistic, you don't stop working, and you just keep on going. And he had this, as I keep on going back there, he had this fierce loyalty of individuals, whether you're Marty Greenberg, Jerry Breslin, lawyers, people that had worked with him in a prosecutor's office, that just never gave up. And why? You know, it's an interesting dynamic. I could see why now. I couldn't see why then.
Okay. Now, why from today's vantage point?
Because he stands for things. He's not afraid to take things on. He did what he thought was in the best interest of the state, especially the second term. Usually you'll find governors, they win the first term, they're a little cautious of what they do, but yet he did the income tax. Second term, they're not as cautious because they're going to do the right thing because they don't owe political IOUs, or they may owe political IOUs, but they're going to come back and do. Second, they learned, they had 4 years at the job, which is a learning curve for everybody. How do you really use this power? Remember now, the governor's office in New Jersey is probably the most powerful governor in the country because no one else runs for a statewide office. You're appointed, whether you be the Attorney General, whether you be a Superior Court, Supreme Court Justice, prosecutors, all require the okay of the governor. So it's a uniqueness that no one else has. So it takes a substantial amount of time to learn to do that and how to do it. And that's what he did the first term on top of the income tax.
You said he stood for things. A lot of people stand for things along a political spectrum. Some stand for liberal things, some stand for conservative things, some stand for compassion, some stand for toughness. What did he stand for?
Without question, integrity. That was number one. Stood for a bench, a judicial branch of government that was untouchable. Interviewed every candidate to be a judge. Kept the politicals like me and everybody else out of that process. That was not our domain, that was not our process, that was not our business. Attracted to people like Dan O'Hearn and Stu Pollak, who later served, and Jimmy Zizali, who later served on the Supreme Court. That's what he stood for.
Was he a reformer? You say that he had this group of loyalists around him who believed in him. Would you call him a reformer?
To some degree, maybe. He was a believer. He wanted to make sure that the Meadowlands got done. He wanted to make sure that integrity was number one in Atlantic City. He wanted to make sure that the Pinelands was preserved, 1 million acres of land. That's a believer, and at the same time, he believed in what he was doing, but it was integrity. The one thing out of the Byrne administration, I would say, on his mind, was integrity.
As a candidate for re-election, what was his strength? What was his weakness?
He would get tired, but at the same time, the last couple of weeks when you saw the crowds and you saw the enthusiasm in the crowds, and I remember one event I believe it was the Robert Treat Hotel, that Grasso, the former governor of Connecticut, came down and gave us, it was a rally. Ella Grasso. And the momentum in that crowd and the response in that crowd.
She was popular? She
was popular, but she really, that was, I remember that as one of the turning points in the campaign.
Really? How close to the election day do you think that might have been?
I think it was pretty close, but I'm not sure.
When did you sense that
the
momentum had shifted?
Well, you started to see more people, number one.
When? How? September, October?
No, I would say in September, last week in September, a couple of weeks in September. I'm sure Alan was raising more money. But at the same time, you just started to see it. You saw the confidence in him. And we just went from there.
Can you pinpoint roughly a date when you felt, okay, we can actually win this thing?
I think it was at the Grasso event, whenever that was.
So
That
late October.
That still stays in my mind, the Grasso event. And yeah.
Go ahead. You were gonna
No,
say.
when she came down that day, it was just a day I remember. I think he felt good. I think we all felt good.
When did you first meet Ray Bateman?
That's an interesting question. I can't really remember. Maybe on the campaign trail.
Did they cross paths?
Yeah. Ray Bateman was a highly dignified individual, very well respected, was a true leader in the state of New Jersey and still is today. Some people say, he just got caught in the campaign, and the Byrne campaign took over the Bateman campaign. I just think people realized that Byrne did the right thing, and we're starting to see that. But I do remember one incident when we were at the Meadowlands opening up the racetrack, and Byrne was there to cut the ribbon. We had to leave because of security reasons. And then we found out that day was the day that the income tax was taken out of paychecks, I believe it was. So he wasn't too warmly welcome
when
there.
When might that have been, around September?
Yeah, September. Yeah, I think it was that. But then people realized that it was the right thing to do, and he just kept.
You said that Bateman got overtaken by
Byrne's campaign.
By Byrne's campaign.
BS program took over, and Byrne just kept on hammering away at that. That there were no alternatives. You voted for this, you did that, in a very dignified manner, mind you. It wasn't hollering and screaming, shouting back and forth.
Pointing out to Bateman that he once did vote for it.
Yeah, I believe so, and also at the same time, what are your alternatives? Your alternatives don't add up to replace the income tax, and just kept that going.
And how did Bateman handle that?
He handled it well, but he knew, I believe he knew that we were right, and it was working.
Did he make mistakes as a candidate, Bateman?
It's easy to be a second quarterback in this thing. I don't really remember. I just really remember our campaign more so than in his campaign.
Did they debate?
They had a couple of debates.
Who was the better debater?
I would have to say Byrne, because he had more issues on his side.
Even after the primary, Byrne's support in Hudson may have been somewhat uncertain. Do you recall that?
Yes.
Why?
Because you had a new team, and the new team wanted to establish their presence, and the new team wanted to make sure that this is the team that's going to gain Byrne's confidence and respect and have access into the governor's office. And those things were reassured, as I remember. And that was a job that probably Henry did more so than that I did, because I was involved in the scheduling side then, not so much the political side.
What does that mean? That
they wanted to make sure they would be sitting at the governor's table. They wanted to make sure that they would have access into the campaign. Wally Shields wanted to make sure, and I think later on he became the Democratic chairman of Hudson County also. He was the state senator. Tommy Smith loved Jersey City, was a Jersey Cityite, wanted to make sure there would be the resources for the city programmatically and things of that nature, and all those assurances were given.
You mentioned the TV commercial that you thought was so good, where Byrne basically apologized.
Right.
You think it ran in the summertime or in the fall?
I think in the fall. And I think that was what I think there was. I can't remember any other commercials than that one, but that would be a Leon. Right.
Have any idea what it cost to run for re-election in those days?
Gosh, no. Probably 1/3 of what it costs right now. I would say it would be lucky to be $5 million, but I'm not sure.
You said that Byrne got tired.
Well, you had to do a schedule where if he had to take a nap, he took a nap.
Did you schedule a nap?
Oh, sure. You schedule private time, things of that nature. The pressure on a candidate, number one, then traveling the state, number two, is just immense. And you didn't in those days, you didn't have to overload it because, you would have your one press conference, that would be the news day. You would make sure you hit the south, you hit the north, and that would be your news day. Then you would add on some of the political things at night, the rallies and things like that, which normally is not covered by the press until like the 2 weeks out of a campaign. So you do the normal Essex County rallies at the last 2 weeks of the campaign.
Is it more strenuous today?
I think it's probably easier today.
Why?
Because of the modern techniques, technical things you have. You do your commercials, which is done. You're in the south. You're in the north. You have it's just an easier format to do. And this is a governor who wanted to be governor again, so you had that added pressure.
Other than John Degnan, were there other optimists around, or were there mainly realists and pessimists?
I think there were a combination of all three, to be honest with you. People would tell him what he wanted to hear, yes, but at the same time, there were sincere people that, as I said before, were working the weekends for Brendan Byrne. Those people you knew thought that Brendan Byrne could win.
Do you recall whether you gave Byrne any advice on how to improve as a speaker or how to be a stronger candidate?
No, that was not my domain, number one. And number two, I still was not afraid, but he still was the governor, and I really didn't have that type of rapport except later on about that. So I was the kid that was sitting there, yes, sir, yes, sir, yes, sir.
Was it harder to schedule a sitting governor than it would have been to schedule someone who was in the private sector?
No, because you could take advantage of a sitting governor. So you can jointly do both schedules. In other words, there might be legislative days where he has to sign a bill. There might be days where getting to different places. So you could coordinate it as long as you had a plan for the first 2 weeks, knowing that those plans will change day to day, but you go back out and you try to formulate a schedule there, making sure you're hitting the right spots, even though you don't have what you're going to say or what you're going to do. You do that, and then you flow in with his schedule in the State House and the schedule that I need. You flow in the debates. You flow in the editorial boards. You flow in the must things that he must do.
Were you, sometimes they call it the body man.
I guess I was a body man at that day. Yeah.
You were the guy who accompanied the governor in the car, in the helicopter,
right.
to event after event.
That's true. Yeah.
What a wonderful
It was
view
unbelievable.
of politics.
Yes, right. Especially like this, because you really got the view, and you really got to see the people. And I believe to this day, that forged the relationship that I have with Byrne.
What relationship do you have with Byrne?
I believe I have a trusting relationship with Brendan Byrne. So therefore, I have no agenda, as some other people. I'm not running for any political office, and I like to be in the back, not in the front. And I believe that the way you gain that type of is, if you're not a long-time friend, is working in a critical campaign like that, day in and day out. And there are a lot of people that Brendan Byrne today can call, and this room would be filled.
Do you recall if Byrne complained about anything during that campaign? the schedule,
Well,
the travel, the news coverage.
Whatever complaining you got, or nothing really sticks in my mind except one trip we made, which I'll tell. You just took that because of the pressure, and it just rolls off of you, and you just go on your way, And
talking about you.
Yeah.
But there was some complaining.
Oh, sure. There's always complaining. Why am I here? Why am I doing this? What idiot did this? I mean, it was I think it was the last week of the campaign. We were traveling, and we added on a stop. And the stop that we added on was the opening of Elizabeth Education Center, the new high school and everything else. And so we landed in the Linden Airport, and this trooper picked us up, and then he was just I think this is like his second week on the job, bright shiny uniform and everything else, and you can tell he was nervous. So we get into the car, and we're driving to the high school for the opening ceremonies and things of that nature. And we're driving and driving. Now, when we were in the air, I noticed that the high school was like maybe a quarter of a mile down the road. So naturally, I say to him, "You do know where you're going, right?" He says, "Yeah." It's driving and driving. So finally, the governor says something to him. "I think you're driving wrong." He said, "No, I'm driving. I know. I think I know where I'm going." Made a turn. It was a dead-end street. This poor trooper, I thought he was going to break down and cry. But he gets over it. He gets angry and he gets over it. That's the way he was able to do it.
But he did get angry.
Oh, yeah.
Is it difficult to separate state government assets from campaign activity? I mean, you're talking about taking a helicopter and a state trooper, and there's a mindset today, at least, and
right.
Probably back then as well,
oh, sure.
that you got to draw strict lines between.
You draw the strict lines, and what had to be paid for was paid for, and what wasn't paid, state events versus political events. All political events, even at that time, was paid for because you did have a sensitivity. And remember, with Byrne you did frequently use the helicopter, so therefore that was the stories in the press all the time. Or there was a one picture of Byrne, I think, going to the National Governors Conference, and they had a picture of him in a Speedo sitting by the pool. So you had those dynamics even back then.
Was that a bad picture?
Oh, yes. But that was trying to say, he's going in the water or something like this. But you lived with that then. So that was in the atmosphere even then.
Was the helicopter an issue in the re-election campaign?
I don't remember it being an issue, but it was there. But Byrne, just kept on using it.
Did he travel a lot?
Yes.
I mean, out of state?
Yes, I think he did the first year.
What was Dick Leone like as campaign manager?
The real Dick Leone?
Yeah.
Oh, moody, tough, knowledgeable, respectful, but at the same time a hard master. But you learn, and you see things and understand why.
He was effective?
Very. At the end of the day, he was very effective.
You learn what? You learn
a campaign. Yes, you learn how to win a campaign. And you know how to put the organization together of a campaign. You have to be lucky with the people that you have. You had people like Walter Bliss, as I said before, Henry, Jeff Lorente, and people like that. So devoted. And that was the uniqueness. Bob Torricelli, devoted.
Is that the key quality, is the devotion and loyalty, or is it the smarts?
I believe smarts is necessary, but the loyalty and the devotion is number 1 and 2. Smarts you always can find. That type of loyalty is very hard to find.
Do you recall whether you had any disagreements with Leon, any conflicts?
No, because I was a learner. I was the student. He'll deny everything I'm saying now. I'll tell you he never did that. Never asked us to leave the room. But you were thoroughly prepared. Why? Because he wanted to make sure the people that were traveling with Byrne knew what was going on, knew what to say, how to say it. That was a whole learning experience. That's a trait I take into every campaign now.
How did the media regard Brendan Byrne's 77 campaign?
I think they gained a lot more respect for him because of the way he campaigned. He didn't shy away. The one-liners were working. So they got to see a different Brendan Byrne. Maybe a seasoned Brendan Byrne. They liked him. And it was also a different press corps than you find today, too. So, well, they were there 24/7. People didn't change. They may change a little bit from newspaper to newspaper, I believe.
When you say people didn't change, you mean less turnover?
Less turnover. They knew the government. They understood. They specialized in different places in government.
Who were the key reporters?
Key reporters in my day were Peter Yorkes,
Bergen Record,
McLaughlin,
John McLaughlin,
New York Times, later on Star Ledger,
New York Daily News,
Daily News, right? Lenny Fisher, the Trenton Bureau, Danny Weissman, you could never sneak anything by him, Vince Cerati. Those were the hawkers, so to speak, right? And don't forget, you had the press corps in the State House. Everyone convened at the snack bar. You had nowhere to go, so you couldn't hide, except you'd still have the back door. But other than that was the continuity of the place.
The reporters were right there,
on
the ground floor,
watching everything.
Right outside the governor's office.
Yes, and the snack bar was right there too.
There's still a cafeteria there where
but
people.
But it's all outside the governor's office.
And some of the key papers have now moved out of the State House.
Right. Yeah, that did not exist before.
Do you recall how the editorials lined up in that?
Well, the editorials were very, very strong, and I don't remember more pro-Byrne than Bateman. Yeah. And the Ledger was very pro-Byrne, and so was the Record, I believe, then.
Were they the two most important in-state papers?
Yes. You didn't have the press at that time where it is, that type of thing. But I think the Record and the Star Ledger was, yes.
In retrospect, what made the Byrne 77 campaign different from many of the other campaigns you've been involved with?
Number one, the number that you came back from, 28 points. That was, and also the statewide ness of running for governor, number one, but number two, the pockets of loyalty that you had there, and enthusiasm and things like that people just kept on working and working.
But you've been involved with many of the statewide campaigns.
But you don't see that as much as today, and people have other agendas than they do with this one. But I think it was the 28 points, just to come back from that number. I know Ray's not going to like that, but that was historic in my view.
What were the key constituency groups you were counting on to carry you to victory?
Minority community, labor in some degree, education, state workers, almost a normal flow. Also, the key constituent group was the independent voter. It was very key then. Democratic base, but the independent voter then.